Rejected for her size and left crying at the altar, Eleanor finds unexpected purpose when a desperate widower welcomes her into his home to care for his ailing son. Will this unconventional family discover that love's true weight is measured not in pounds, but in the fullness of the heart? Blood dripped from Thomas Abernathy's thumb as the needle slipped again. He sucked the wound, tasting iron, and held up his son's shirt to the fading September light. The stitches looked awful, nothing like Sarah would have done. His wife had been gone 3 years now, but some days the hole she left felt fresh as yesterday. 6-year-old James coughed from inside the small farmhouse, a hollow sound that echoed through the empty rooms. That cough haunted Thomas. It was the same rattle that had started in Sarah's chest before the consumption took her. Pa! James appeared in the doorway, thin shoulders poking through his nightshirt. My throat hurts. Thomas set down the mending. Come here, buddy. He pulled his son onto his lap, feeling the boy's forehead. Too warm. Fear clutched at his heart. I miss Mama, James whispered, burying his face against Thomas's shoulder. I know. Thomas rocked the child, watching the sunset paint the drought-stricken fields golden. Half his corn had withered under the merciless summer. What remained wouldn't bring enough money to last the winter, let alone pay for medicine if James's cough worsened. Thomas carried James back to bed, tucking the worn quilt around him. Try to sleep. I'll bring you some honey water for that throat. In the kitchen, Thomas splashed water on his face. The mirror above the wash basin reflected a stranger hair graying at 35, eyes hollow with worry. Around him, the house stood quiet and cold. No bread baking, no humming as Sarah worked. Just empty space where happiness used to live. The next morning, Thomas hitched their only horse to the wagon. Mrs. Peterson will look in on you, he told James as he tucked another blanket around him. I need to sell what corn we've got before prices drop lower. Can I come? I'm feeling better. James tried to sit up, but another coughing fit doubled him over. Not today, son. Thomas felt his child's forehead again. Definitely feverish. Rest. That's an order from your commanding officer. He saluted, winning a small smile from James. The 5-mile journey to town stretched before him. Thomas flicked the reins, mind churning with worry. Dr. Williams wanted payment up front now. The last 3 families who'd bought on credit had skipped town when their farms failed. The town of Millfield sat nestled in a valley, church steeple rising above the trees. Once, Thomas had felt pride riding into town. His farm had been prosperous, his wife admired, his future secure. Now he hunched his shoulders against the pitying glances. Morning, Thomas. Sheriff Miller nodded as Thomas passed. How's the boy? Holding his own. Thomas didn't slow the wagon. He couldn't bear kindness today. At Pearson's general store, Thomas unloaded his corn while Mr. Pearson tallied the payment. $5. Less than half what he needed. Sorry, Thomas. Pearson counted out the coins. Harvest was too good down south. Markets flooded. Thomas pocketed the money. Got any work? Anything at all? Pearson shook his head. Try the mill. Heard they need someone to haul lumber. The mill sat at the edge of town, its grate wheel turning lazily in the creek. The foreman looked Thomas up and down. We're full up, he said, not unkindly. Got 20 men begging for work yesterday. Thomas wandered back toward town, stomach growling. He hadn't eaten since yesterday noon, saving what little food they had for James. As he passed the church, he noticed a crowd gathering. Ladies in their Sunday best, men in black suits, flowers decorating the steps. A wedding. Thomas looked away. Happiness belonged to other people now. Beautiful day for a wedding, Mayor Porter boomed, clapping Thomas on the shoulder. You should come in. Whole town's invited to see my boy Nathaniel marry the Mills girl. Thomas murmured an excuse. The last thing he needed was to watch other people's joy while his own world crumbled. At the Mercantile, he spent $2 precious on medicine for James, cough syrup and fever powder. The shopkeeper's wife slipped an extra stick of licorice into his package. For the boy, she whispered. Thomas nodded gratefully. Outside, clouds gathered. The air smelled like rain, the first in months. Thomas hurried back to his wagon, eager to return home before the storm broke. As he loaded his meager purchases, laughter and music drifted from the church. The rain began halfway home, fat drops soaking through his shirt. Thomas hunched forward, urging the horse faster. All he could think about was James, alone and sick. Mrs. Peterson would have left at noon. She had her own family to care for. The wagon will hit a rut, jarring his bones. Thomas gritted his teeth. He needed help, not charity. He couldn't bear that. But someone to watch James while Thomas took on extra work. Someone to cook meals and clean the house. Someone to make sure his boy didn't die of the same illness that took Sarah. But hiring help took money, and money meant selling the farm. The thought twisted in his gut. That land was his father's legacy, meant to be James's someday. How could he give it up? Lightning cracked across the sky. The horse whinnied in fear, pulling harder against the reins. Rain became a downpour, turning the road to mud that sucked at the wheels. Thomas squinted through the deluge, barely able to see 10 feet ahead. "Easy, girl," he soothed the frightened animal. Almost home. By the time the farmhouse came into view, Thomas was soaked to the bone and shivering. He stabled the horse and splashed through puddles to the house. "James," Thomas called, pushing open the door. "I'm back." James lay exactly where Thomas had left him, face flushed with fever. The boy opened glassy eyes. "Pa, did you bring medicine?" Thomas knelt beside the bed, brushing wet hair from his forehead. "Yes, son. And licorice too. Your favorite." As James sipped the cough syrup, Thomas built up the fire. Outside, rain hammered the roof, a blessing for the fields, but it also meant water would soon leak through the patches in the ceiling. "Pa!" James's voice sounded small. "Am I going to heaven like Mama?" Thomas froze, then sat on the bed and pulled his son close. "No, you're staying right here with me." But as night fell and James's fever climbed higher, Thomas found himself praying for the first time since Sarah died. He placed cold compresses on the boy's forehead and spooned broth between his cracked lips. "Don't you leave me too," he whispered as James finally drifted into restless sleep. "I couldn't bear it." Thomas slumped in the chair beside the bed, listening to the rain and his son's labored breathing. Tomorrow he would have to find work, any work, no matter how hard or demeaning. He needed money for the doctor, for better food, for someone to help care for James. Tomorrow he would swallow his pride. His son's life was worth more than that. But tonight, he kept watch, his hand resting on James's small chest, feeling each breath rise and fall, while the storm raged outside and fear gnawed at his heart. Church bells rang through the rainy gloom, but they weren't celebrating anymore. Thomas shielded his eyes against the downpour as he hurried toward town. James's fever had broken at dawn, but the cough remained, deep and worrying. Dr. Williams had to see him today, money or no money. A crowd huddled under the church's awning despite the storm. Thomas slowed, curiosity momentarily overriding his urgency. People whispered behind hands, eyes fixed on something, or someone by the church steps. "Disgraceful," Mrs. Porter hissed loudly enough for Thomas to hear. "My poor Nathaniel." Thomas edged closer, the crowd parting to reveal a woman sitting alone on a bench in the rain. Her white wedding dress clung to her body, sodden and muddy at the hem. Dark hair tumbled from what remained of an elaborate style, hairpins gleaming on the ground around her feet. She stared straight ahead, seemingly blind to the rain soaking her to the skin. Thomas recognized her vaguely, Eleanor Mills, who worked at the millinery shop. The mayor's son Nathaniel was supposed to marry her today. "What happened?" Thomas asked the blacksmith's wife. "Nathaniel changed his mind at the altar," she whispered gleefully. "Said he couldn't go through with it. That she was too." She gestured vaguely at Eleanor's ample figure. Thomas frowned. The woman wasn't thin, certainly, but she had a pleasant face with high cheekbones and clear skin. What kind of man abandoned his bride before all these people? Shouldn't someone help her? Thomas nodded toward Eleanor. The blacksmith's wife sniffed. Her sister tried. She wouldn't budge. The crowd began dispersing as the rain intensified. Thomas hesitated, then stepped out from under the awning and approached the bench. "Miss," he stood awkwardly before her. "You're getting soaked." Eleanor Mills raised her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, as if she'd cried herself empty. "I'm already ruined. A little rain won't matter. At least come under the awning." Thomas held out his hand. Eleanor stared at his calloused palm. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." No one should sit alone in a storm. The simple truth of it hung between them. After a long moment, Eleanor took his hand and allowed him to help her up. The wet fabric of her dress must have added 20 pounds, but she moved with a grace that surprised him. Under the church awning, Thomas shrugged out of his coat and offered it to her. She wrapped it around her shoulders, her wedding dress a sodden mess beneath. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy." Thomas Abernathy. Recognition flickered in her eyes. The widower with the boy. "I've seen you in town." She pulled his coat tighter. "I'm Eleanor Mills, though I suppose everyone knows that now." A fresh wave of murmurs rose as Nathaniel Porter emerged from the church, his parents flanking him protectively. Eleanor stiffened beside Thomas. "Ellie, please," Nathaniel called, not quite meeting her eyes. "Be reasonable. This is for the best." Eleanor's voice cut like ice. "The best would have been telling me last week, Nathaniel. Not after I put on the dress." Mayor Porter stepped forward. "Now see here, Miss Mills. My son simply realized you weren't compatible. These things happen." "Compatible?" Eleanor's laugh held no humor. "You mean I'm too fat for your family portrait?" The mayor's wife gasped at the crude word. Nathaniel flushed deep red. "That's not it at all," he protested weakly. "It's just, you told Reverend Harper you couldn't bear the thought of looking at me across the breakfast table for the next 40 years, Eleanor said flatly. "Everyone heard you." Thomas felt a surge of disgust. He'd never liked the Porter family much, too proud of their money, too quick to judge others. Now he actively disliked them. "You deserve better anyway," he said quietly to Eleanor. She glanced at him, surprise replacing the hurt in her eyes for just a moment. "Eleanor, dear." Mrs. Porter stepped forward with a strained smile. "We've paid for your dress, of course, and Nathaniel is prepared to provide a small settlement for your disappointment. Keep your money." Eleanor straightened her spine, pulling Thomas's coat closer around her shoulders. "I don't want anything from you." "Don't be foolish, girl," Mayor Porter frowned. "You're not exactly swimming in prospects. Take what's offered." Thomas saw Eleanor flinch as if she'd been struck. Before he could think better of it, he stepped between her and the Porters. "I think Miss Mills has made herself clear." His voice came out harder than intended. "She doesn't want your charity." Mayor Porter's eyes narrowed. "I don't believe anyone asked for your opinion, Abernathy. How's that farm of yours doing? Heard you might be selling soon." The jab hit its mark. Thomas clenched his jaw against a retort. Eleanor touched his arm. "It's all right, Mr. Abernathy. I can fight my own battles." To the Porters, she added, "Good day to you all. Enjoy the cake. I picked the flavor myself." She walked away with her head high, still wearing Thomas's coat. After a moment's hesitation, he followed her down the church steps. "Where are you going?" he asked as they reached the muddy street. "Home. To explain to my sister why I'm not married. To pack my things." Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. "To figure out what happens next." Thomas nodded. His own problems came flooding back. James sick at home, the doctor he couldn't afford, the work he desperately needed. "I should go," he said. "My boy's ill." Eleanor stopped. "I'm sorry. I've kept you from your errands." She began removing his coat. "Keep it for now," Thomas said. "Return it when it's convenient." "Thank you." Eleanor met his eyes directly for the first time. For the coat. And for standing up to them. Something about her direct gaze made Thomas uncomfortable. It had been a long time since he'd really looked at a woman, or had one look at him with such clear-eyed assessment. "Anyone would have done the same," he muttered. No, Eleanor said simply. They wouldn't. They parted ways at the corner, Eleanor toward the residential streets where she lived with her sister, Thomas toward the doctor's house. He watched her go, a bedraggled figure in a ruined white dress and a too large coat, shoulders squared against the pity of onlookers. At the doctor's house, Thomas swallowed his pride and explained about James. To his surprise, Dr. Williams agreed to visit that afternoon. Pay when you can, Thomas, the older man said. I knew your father. He was a good man. The afternoon brought clearing skies. Thomas worked frantically to patch the roof before the doctor arrived. Inside, he straightened the small house, acutely aware of its shabbiness. The doctor would see the empty pantry, the worn furniture, the clear signs of a household without a woman's touch. Dr. Williams arrived as the sun emerged. He examined James thoroughly while Thomas hovered anxiously. Bronchitis, the doctor pronounced finally. Not consumption, so you can stop looking so frightened. But he needs rest, good food, and someone to watch him when you're working. He packed his bag and fixed Thomas with a stern look. You can't do everything alone, Thomas. You need help. I know. Thomas walked the doctor out. I've been thinking about hiring someone. A housekeeper or a wife. Dr. Williams raised an eyebrow. Thomas shook his head firmly. No, that chapter's closed. The doctor climbed into his buggy. Well, find someone. That boy needs more care than you can give while keeping this farm going. After the doctor left, Thomas sat on the porch steps, mind racing. Hire help with what money? Sell part of the farm? The thought made him sick, but what choice did he have? As dusk fell, a figure appeared on the road, a woman in a plain dark dress, carrying a bundle. It took Thomas a moment to recognize Eleanor Mills without her wedding finery. Miss Mills. She stopped at the bottom of the steps. Mr. Abernathy, I've brought your coat back. She held out the neatly folded garment. You didn't need to walk all this way. Thomas took the coat, noting how clean and pressed it looked. Thank you. Eleanor didn't leave. She stood looking at the farm, the unrepaired fence, the struggling crops, the peeling paint on the house. How is your son? She asked. Better. Doctor came today. Said it's bronchitis. Not. He couldn't finish the sentence. Eleanor nodded. That's good news. She hesitated. Mr. Abernathy, I heard in town that you might be looking for help. Someone to keep house and care for your boy while you work. Thomas stared at her. You're offering? I need a position. Eleanor's voice was matter-of-fact. My sister's husband doesn't want me staying with them indefinitely. And after today, she shrugged. Millfield doesn't have many opportunities for unmarried women, especially ones with my reputation. Thomas struggled to form a response. It wouldn't be easy work. The house is run down. The pay wouldn't be much. I don't need much, just a roof and meals. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I'm a hard worker, can cook, clean, so I helped raise my sister's children. From inside came the sound of James coughing. Thomas glanced toward the house. People would talk, he said. A single woman living here. People are already talking about both of us. Eleanor smiled faintly. What's a little more gossip? Thomas considered her, not just her appearance, but the quiet dignity with which she held herself despite the day's humiliation. There was a steadiness to her that reminded him of Sarah, though the two women couldn't look more different. I can offer room and board plus $2 a week, he said finally. The back bedroom is small but private. When would you want me to start? Thomas thought of James alone while he worked, of the meals he couldn't cook properly, of the endless lonely nights. Tomorrow, he suggested. If that's not too soon. Eleanor nodded. Tomorrow, then. She turned to go, then paused. Mr. Abernathy? I won't disappoint you. Thomas watched her walk away, her figure silhouetted against the sunset. For the first time in months, he felt a small flicker of hope. Inside, James was awake, his eyes bright in the lamplight. Who was that lady, Pa? Thomas sat on the edge of the bed. Miss Mills. She's gonna help us for a while. Cook and clean. Look after you when I'm working. James considered this. Like a ma. No. Thomas tucked the blanket around him. Not like that. Just helping out. Is she nice? Thomas thought about Eleanor standing tall before the porters, refusing their money, walking miles to return his coat. Yes, he said. I think she's very nice. As he doused the lamp, Thomas wondered if he'd made a mistake. A woman he barely knew moving into their home. The town would certainly think so. But watching his son finally drift into peaceful sleep, Thomas couldn't bring himself to regret the decision. Something had to change. They couldn't go on as they had been. Tomorrow would bring Eleanor Mills to their door, with all her complications and the weight of recent scandal. But it would also bring help when they desperately needed it. Sometimes, Thomas thought as he stretched out on his lonely bed, salvation came in unexpected packages. Blood-red sunset painted the sky as Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway of her sister's home. I can't stay here forever, Martha. Her fingers clutched a letter her parents demanding she return home in disgrace. Nonsense, Martha replied, bouncing her fussy baby. Edward doesn't mind. The tight smile on her brother-in-law's face told a different story. 3 adults in a 2-room cottage meant Eleanor slept behind a curtain, listening to whispered arguments each night. I saw a notice at the general store, Martha offered. The schoolteacher needs help with the younger children. Eleanor's stomach twisted. And face 20 sets of curious eyes every day? Children who'll ask why Mr. Porter didn't want me. The next morning, Eleanor trudged to the millinery shop where Mrs. Henderson had offered temporary work. Not as a saleswoman Eleanor's size might discourage customers seeking fashionable accessories, but as a backroom stitcher, hidden from public view. Her needle stabbed fabric with quick, angry jabs. A week had passed since the wedding that wasn't. The memory of Nathaniel's face. The way his smile dropped when she walked down the aisle. How he'd whispered, I can't, before fleeing, burned like acid. Miss Mills. Mrs. Henderson poked her head around the curtain. There's a gentleman asking for you. Eleanor's heart stuttered. Had Nathaniel returned? She smoothed her hair, hating herself for hoping. Instead, she found Thomas Abernathy standing awkwardly by the ribbon display, hat in hand. Wind and sun had carved deep lines around his eyes. His clothes hung loose on his frame, suggesting a man who forgot to eat. Miss Mills, he said, nodding. Thomas Abernathy. We met during the storm. Recognition flickered. Mr. Abernathy. How can I help you? Thomas glanced at Mrs. Henderson, who pretended to rearrange bonnets while clearly listening. Might we speak privately? Just for a moment. Outside, clouds gathered above the dusty street. Thomas cleared his throat twice before speaking. My boy's sick. Nothing catching, he added quickly, seeing her alarm. But he needs care I can't give while working the fields. His fingers twisted his hat brim. I need help, Miss Mills. Paid help, of course. Eleanor blinked. You're offering me employment? As what, exactly? A housekeeper. Cook too if you can manage it. I'm not much in the kitchen myself. His attempt at a smile revealed a chipped front tooth. There's a small room off the kitchen. It's not fancy, but it's private. You want me to live in your home? Alone with you and your son? Eleanor couldn't keep the shock from her voice. Thomas's face reddened. It's a proper arrangement. I'll sleep in the barn if that eases your mind. He looked at his boots. Truth is, I'm desperate. James hasn't been right since his mother passed. He needs a woman's gentleness. Why me? Eleanor asked. There must be widows or older girls in town more suited. Because you were kind to my boy that day in the rain, Thomas interrupted. He mentioned it later. Said your smile reminded him of his mama's. A lump formed in Eleanor's throat. No one had called her kind since the wedding disaster. They called her pitiful, unfortunate, too big for her own good. People will talk, she whispered. They're already talking about me. Thomas met her eyes directly. Let them talk about us both, then. Later that afternoon, Eleanor sat in Martha's kitchen, explaining the offer. Her sister's face grew pinched with worry. It's not proper, Martha insisted. A single woman living under a widower's roof? You'll ruin what's left of your reputation. What reputation? Eleanor laughed bitterly. The woman too fat for marriage? The burdened sister? At least there I'd be useful. You could wait, Martha suggested. Someone else might come along. Who? The men in this town have seen me rejected. No one wants Nathaniel Porter's leftovers, especially not. She gestured at her substantial figure. Edward entered, overhearing the last exchange. The Abernathy farm's falling apart, he commented. Man can't keep up since his wife died. Fields gone to weeds. House probably a disaster. I'm good at cleaning, Eleanor said quietly. And I can cook well enough. Martha grabbed her hands. But what about your future? Your chance for a family of your own? Eleanor pulled away. That dream died in the church. I need to build something new now. As dusk fell, Eleanor packed her trunk. The same one she'd prepared for her honeymoon. Her wedding dress lay at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper. She couldn't bear to look at it, but couldn't throw away all those hours of careful stitching either. Martha cried when the wagon came. Thomas waited on the seat. James bundled beside him despite the warm evening. The boy's face was pale, his thin shoulders hunched beneath a too large coat. Are you certain? Martha whispered, clutching Eleanor's hand. Eleanor watched Thomas help James drink from a canteen, his large hands gentle around his son's small ones. No, she admitted, but I'm certain I can't stay here. The wagon creaked under Eleanor's weight as she climbed aboard. James stared with solemn eyes that seemed too old for his young face. Hello again, Eleanor said softly. Pa says you're coming to make me better, the boy replied. Thomas flicked the reins. I said Miss Mills is coming to help us both, James. The Abernathy farm lay 3 miles outside town, far enough that Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders as buildings gave way to open fields. The wagon bounced over ruts, forcing her to grip the wooden seat. Sorry for the rough road, Thomas said. Haven't had time to fill the holes. As they crested a hill, the farmhouse came into view. Even in the fading light, Eleanor could see its neglected state. Sagging porch, missing shingles, garden overrun with weeds. A home slowly surrendering to grief. James coughed, a wet sound that rattled in his chest. Thomas's face tightened with worry. Has the doctor seen him? Eleanor asked. Can't afford another visit, Thomas admitted. Doc said it's not consumption, just weakness from the winter cold that won't leave him. Inside, the house smelled of sickness and bachelor living, unwashed dishes, stale bread, and the sharp tang of liniment. A shirt soaked in a bucket by the stove. Laundry interrupted by more urgent needs. Your room, Thomas said, opening a door off the kitchen. A narrow bed with a faded quilt occupied most of the space. A small window faced east, and a wooden chest stood at the foot of the bed. It was the pantry once. Sarah, my wife, converted it when James was born. For his nurse. Eleanor set down her trunk. The room was small but clean, unlike the rest of the house. I tidied it yesterday, Thomas explained, seeing her surprise. Didn't want you thinking we lived like pigs. James appeared in the doorway, nightshirt hanging to his ankles. Are you going to be my new mama? He asked bluntly. Eleanor's face burned. No, dear. I'm just here to help while you get better. She knelt before him, feeling his forehead with the back of her hand. Fever still, though not dangerously high. His brown eyes, so like his father's, studied her face with unnerving directness. You're big, he observed simply. James, Thomas scolded. That's not polite. Eleanor smiled despite herself. Yes, I am. Does that bother you? James shook his head. Mama was small. The fever took her quick. His little hand touched Eleanor's arm. You look strong. Maybe the fever can't catch you. That night, lying in a stranger's house listening to a child's labored breathing through the thin wall, Eleanor wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But when James called out in the darkness, she found herself moving without hesitation, a cool cloth in her hand and soothing words on her lips. From the doorway, Thomas watched her comfort his son. Their eyes met across the darkened room. No words passed between them, but something shifted nonetheless, an acknowledgement of shared purpose that felt surprisingly like hope. The knife slipped, slicing Eleanor's finger instead of the apple. Blood dripped onto the kitchen floor, bright red against worn wood. 2 weeks had passed since she'd arrived at the Abernathy farm, and still she felt like a stranger in this grief-shadowed house. "Botheration," she muttered, wrapping her apron around the cut. "Miss Eleanor hurt?" James appeared in the doorway, hair tousled from napping. His cough had improved slightly, though his chest still rattled with each deep breath. Eleanor forced a smile. "Just a small cut. Nothing to worry about." James crossed to her, taking her large hand in his small ones. "Papa kisses hurts better," he informed her solemnly. "Does he now?" Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. "Well, I think I'll mend just fine with a bandage." Outside, rain pounded the tin roof. Thomas would be soaked when he returned from mending fences in the north pasture. Eleanor added more wood to the stove, determined to have something hot waiting. The pantry had been nearly empty when she arrived. A few potatoes, some beans, half a sack of flour speckled with weevils. Her first trip to town had revealed another problem. The Abernethys had outstanding debts at the general store, and Mr. Willard had been reluctant to extend further credit. Eleanor had used her first week's earnings to purchase essentials, ignoring Mr. Willard's raised eyebrows when she explained whose household she was supplying. "Miss Eleanor?" James tugged her skirt. "Can I help?" She nodded, pulling a chair to the counter. "You can stir while I chop." Working together, they prepared a thick stew with the last of the salt pork. James chattered about frogs and cloud shapes and a pony he'd seen once at the county fair. His words tumbled over each other, as if he'd stored them up during the silent months after his mother's death. The front door banged open. Thomas stomped in, streaming water. His eyes widened at the sight of his son perched on a kitchen chair, face flushed with excitement rather than fever. "We're making stew, Papa," James announced. "I helped." Thomas's gaze moved from his son to Eleanor, confusion and something else, gratitude, perhaps, flickering across his weathered face. "Thought you'd be wet and hungry," Eleanor explained, suddenly self-conscious under his steady gaze. "There's coffee too." "Coffee?" Thomas hung his dripping coat by the door. "Haven't had proper coffee since Sarah died," Eleanor silently finished. The woman's absence hung in every corner of the house, the faded square on the wall where her portrait once hung, the neglected flower beds she'd once tended, the mending pile grown mountainous without her needle. "James, fetch your father a dry shirt," Eleanor directed, turning back to her cooking. The boy scrambled off his chair, eager to help. Alone in the kitchen, Thomas cleared his throat. "You've done more than expected, Miss Mills." Eleanor stirred the stew, not meeting his eyes. "Idle hands invite the devil. Is that why you're scrubbing floors at dawn? Planting a vegetable patch when James naps? Mending shirts I'd planned to use as rags?" His voice held no accusation, only wondering. Eleanor shrugged. "I need to earn my keep." "You already do with James." Thomas stepped closer. "He's different with you here. More himself." She glanced up, surprised by the emotion in his voice. Thomas Abernathy wasn't a man who revealed himself easily. 2 weeks under his roof, and she still knew little more than when she'd arrived. "He's a good boy," she said. "Smart too. He should be in school." Thomas's face closed. "The schoolhouse is 3 miles away. Too far for him to walk in his condition." "I could teach him," Eleanor offered. "I finished 8th grade. Know my letters and sums well enough." Before Thomas could answer, James returned, a faded blue shirt clutched in his hands. "I found the one with no holes, Papa." Over supper, James dominated the conversation, appetite and spirits equally improved. Eleanor noticed Thomas watching his son with a mixture of joy and disbelief, as if witnessing a miracle. Later, with James asleep and dishes washed, Eleanor sat by the fire darning socks. Thomas entered quietly, a small wooden box in his hands. "Found this in the shed," he said, placing it on the table between them. Thought you might have use for it. Eleanor opened the box to find sewing notions, buttons, ribbons, thread in a rainbow of colors, delicate scissors with carved handles. Sarah's, Thomas explained, seemed a waste, them sitting unused. Eleanor gently closed the lid. I couldn't possibly. Please. His voice roughened. She would have wanted them used by capable hands. The following days established a rhythm. Eleanor rose first, lighting fires and starting breakfast before Thomas headed to the fields. Mornings found her and James bent over a worn primer, the boy's finger tracing letters while she encouraged his progress. Afternoons were for household tasks, scrubbing floors, beating rugs, preserving the early garden harvest. By October's end, changes showed throughout the farmhouse. Curtains appeared in windows long left bare. The mending pile dwindled. Jars of pickled beans lined newly scrubbed shelves. James's nighttime coughing fits grew less frequent, thanks to Eleanor's herbal teas and chest compresses. Most noticeable was the transformation in James himself. Color returned to his cheeks. He gained weight, his thin frame filling out under Eleanor's careful feeding. His solemn demeanor gave way to childish enthusiasms, collecting interesting rocks, constructing elaborate stories about barn cats, begging for one more tale before bedtime. These evening story sessions became a cherished ritual. Initially, Thomas would disappear to the barn during these times. Gradually, however, he began lingering in the doorway, then sitting on the floor just inside the room, and finally claiming the rough wooden chair beside his son's bed. Your voice changes when you read, he observed one evening as they left James's room. Gets all soft and musical-like. Eleanor blushed. My father read to us each night. 6 children crowded around one book. I try to do the voices like he did. You do them well. Thomas paused at the foot of the stairs. Better than I manage. Eleanor sensed his guilt. You've been keeping this farm together alone, she said gently. That's no small thing. Their eyes held for a moment longer than customary. Thomas looked away first, mumbling about checking the animals before turning toward the door. November brought first frost and with it the butchering. Eleanor hadn't expected to be included in this masculine domain, but Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway at dawn, face questioning. Ever helped with hog butchering? He asked. Eleanor nodded. My father raised us all to be useful, daughters and sons alike. Together they worked through the crisp morning, transforming a fat hog into winter provisions. Eleanor's strong hands proved adept at the sticky, bloody business. Thomas watched with undisguised appreciation as she expertly salted hams and mixed sausage seasonings. Most women would have stayed inside, he commented as they cleaned up afterward. I'm not most women, Eleanor replied without thinking. Thomas's quiet no, you certainly aren't warmed her more than the steaming wash water. That Sunday, Eleanor visited her sister's family as had become her custom. Martha greeted her with worried eyes and pulling her immediately into the bedroom. People are talking, Martha whispered urgently. Mrs. Porter mentioned in church that Thomas Abernathy has you practically running his household. Says it's indecent, the two of you alone out there. We're not alone, Eleanor protested. James is always present. A child hardly counts as a chaperone. Martha wrung her hands. Eleanor, you must understand how this appears. I'm employed as his housekeeper, Eleanor insisted. Nothing improper has occurred. Impropriety isn't just in actions. Martha lowered her voice further. It's in possibilities, in temptations under one roof. Eleanor's face heated. Thomas Abernathy remains devoted to his deceased wife's memory. He has shown me nothing but proper respect. But later, walking back to the farm through golden afternoon light, Eleanor examined her own feelings with uncomfortable honesty. She'd begun anticipating Thomas's return from the fields each evening, found herself noticing details, the gray threading through his dark hair, the rare sound of his laughter when James said something unexpectedly funny, the gentleness of his large, work-roughened hands. Foolishness, she murmured to herself. Pure foolishness. That evening, Thomas found her on the porch, mending by the last daylight. "You've been quiet since returning from your sister's." Eleanor kept her eyes on her needle. "Mrs. Porter visited the millinery shop Friday. Told Mrs. Henderson you were taking advantage of my situation. That no respectable household would have a jilted woman under their roof." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Since when are the Porters the keepers of respectability?" "Since always in this town." Eleanor set down her mending. "Perhaps I should leave. I've saved some wages. Could find a position in the city." "And leave James?" Thomas's voice sharpened. "Leave?" He stopped abruptly. "We've come to rely on you," he finished softer. "That's the problem," Eleanor admitted. "I've come to rely on you both as well." She twisted the thimble on her finger. "I never expected to feel at home here." Thomas stared across the darkening fields. Before Sarah died, this place felt alive. After, it was just land and buildings. He turned to face her. "You've brought life back, Eleanor. Not by replacing what was lost, but by creating something new." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "Thomas, Papa, Miss Eleanor." James appeared in the doorway, nightshirt flapping around his ankles. "I finished my letters practice. Come see." The moment broke. Eleanor rose, straightening her skirts. "We'll be right there, James." That night, Thomas dreamed of Sarah. She stood in their bedroom doorway, pointing toward James's room where Eleanor sat reading the boy a story. In the dream, Sarah smiled not in sadness or resignation, but with approval. He woke with tears on his cheeks and a knot in his throat that felt suspiciously like hope. The scream woke Thomas in the dead of night. He bolted upright, heart hammering. It came again. "James." Thomas grabbed his shotgun and raced down the hall in his nightclothes. He found Eleanor already there, cradling his son. James thrashed in her arms, his skin burning hot to the touch. "The wolf," James cried. "The wolf with red eyes." "Fever dreams," Eleanor whispered, meeting Thomas's frightened gaze. His forehead's on fire. Outside, wind howled like a living thing, rattling windows and pushing snow against the house in drifts taller than a man. The harshest winter in 30 years had Millfield in its grip, with no doctor for miles. "We need Dr. Wilson," Thomas said, reaching for his coat. Eleanor caught his arm. "You'll freeze before you reach town. Nobody travels in this." James coughed a deep, rattling sound that reminded Thomas too much of Sarah's final days. He couldn't lose his boy too. He just couldn't. "I'll make willow bark tea," Eleanor said, already moving, "and mustard plasters for his chest. My grandmother taught me." Through that endless night, they fought the fever together. Thomas broke ice from the water barrel while Eleanor tore up sheets for cool compresses. When James couldn't stop shivering, Thomas built the fire so high it threatened to crack the chimney stones. When the boy couldn't swallow, Eleanor moistened his lips with honey water, patient as a saint. "Tell me about your wife," Eleanor said as dawn approached, her voice soft in the dim light. They sat on either side of James's bed, watching his restless sleep. Thomas's throat tightened. Sarah was small but mighty, stubborn as a mule, always singing, even when there wasn't much to sing about. "James has her chin," Eleanor observed, touching the boy's face gently. "And her cough," Thomas said, the fear rising again. "This is how it started with her too." Eleanor reached across the bed and took his hand. Her fingers were strong, work-worn, nothing like Sarah's delicate ones. Yet Thomas found himself holding on like a drowning man. "My father used to say sickness was just the body fighting a battle," Eleanor said. "James is a fighter, like his mother." By noon, the storm had eased enough for Thomas to check the animals. The barn door had blown open, letting in a mountain of snow. 2 chickens lay frozen, and the cow bellowed her displeasure at the late milking. As Thomas worked, his mind stayed in the sickroom with his son, and with Eleanor. What was happening between them? She'd come as hired help, nothing more. Yet these past weeks, watching her care for James, seeing her strength and kindness, He caught himself watching her hands as she kneaded bread, wondering how they'd feel against his cheek. But what kind of man was he, to think such things while his boy fought for breath? And what kind of woman would want a broken-down farmer with a sickly child? When Thomas returned, he found Eleanor teaching James a game with stones on a checkerboard. The boy's eyes were bright, but clear. "The fever broke," Eleanor said, her face showing the same relief Thomas felt flooding through him. He asked for food. That evening, after James had eaten a little broth and fallen into real sleep, Thomas found Eleanor in the kitchen. She stood at the window, watching the moonlight on snow, wrapped in one of Sarah's old shawls. The sight stopped him cold, not because it reminded him of his dead wife, but because it didn't. Eleanor looked right in their home, as if she'd always belonged. "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice rough. "For James. For everything." Eleanor turned, her face soft in the lamplight. "He's a special boy. You've raised him well on your own." "Not well enough. If you hadn't been here today." The thought was too terrible to finish. Eleanor moved closer. "But I was here. Sometimes God puts people where they're needed." "Is that why you're here?" "God's plan." She laughed softly. Nathaniel Porter certainly didn't think so. Too big for God's plan. That's what his mother told him. Anger flashed through Thomas. "Then he's a fool who can't see what's right in front of him." "And what's that?" The words came before Thomas could stop them. "A woman worth 10 of any thin, silly girl in this town." Eleanor's eyes widened. Thomas hadn't meant to speak so plain, but the day's fear had stripped away his caution. He stepped forward, close enough to smell the lavender she wore in her collar. "Eleanor, Pa!" James called from upstairs. "Miss Eleanor? I'm thirsty." The moment broke. Eleanor stepped back, her cheeks pink. "I should check his fever again." Later, Thomas lay awake, listening to the wind die down. In the next room, he could hear Eleanor moving around, getting ready for bed. Such a thin wall between them, such a vast distance too. He remembered Sarah, how they'd planned 3 children, a bigger house, growing old surrounded by grandchildren. How quickly dreams could shatter. How unexpected it was to find new ones taking shape. Just before dawn, the sound of sleigh bells woke him. Pulling on his coat, Thomas found Reverend Harper at the door, shovel in hand. "Came to check on outlying families," the Reverend explained, stomping snow from his boots. "This storm's taken 2 over in Hanceville. Thought I'd see if you needed anything." Thomas invited him in for coffee. As the Reverend warmed himself by the fire, Thomas heard Eleanor moving about upstairs, getting James his medicine. "Thomas," the Reverend said carefully, "folks in town are talking. Folks always talk. About you and Miss Mills, living here unmarried. It doesn't look right." Thomas stiffened. "She's James's caretaker. Nothing improper about it." The Reverend looked doubtful. "Even so, a young, unmarried woman, living under your roof." He paused as Eleanor appeared in the doorway, carrying an empty teacup. Miss Mills, we were just discussing your situation." Eleanor's face went carefully blank. "I see. The Reverend thinks people might gossip," Thomas said. "People have gossiped about me since I was 12 and grew too big for my dresses," Eleanor replied with a calmness that impressed Thomas. "I'm used to it." "Nevertheless," Reverend Harper continued, "appearances matter, for the boy's sake if nothing else." Before either could respond, they heard a crash from upstairs, followed by James's cry. All 3 rushed up to find the boy had tried to get out of bed and collapsed, knocking over the washstand. As Eleanor gathered James back into bed, Thomas saw the moment the Reverend noticed the genuine care between them. Not just employer and employee, but something deeper. Reverend Harper pulled Thomas aside. "I came about more than just checking on you," he admitted. "The widow Collins asked about you. She's looking to remarry, has a tidy sum put aside. Proper match for a man in your position." Thomas watched Eleanor singing softly to James, her hand cool against the boy's forehead. "I'm not interested in the widow Collins." The Reverend followed his gaze, then shook his head. She was left at the altar, Thomas. There's a reason for that. Think about James's future. But Thomas was thinking about James's smile when Eleanor read to him. About the way the house felt like a home again. About the brush of her hand against his when they worked together. After the Reverend left, Thomas found Eleanor in the kitchen, angrily kneading bread dough. "He had no right to talk about you that way," Thomas said. "He's right, though," Eleanor said, not looking up. "People will always talk. I shouldn't have come here." "I'm glad you did," Thomas said simply. She finally met his eyes. "Why?" "Because," Thomas began, but the words stuck in his throat. Just then, a sound at the window made them both turn. There stood Nathaniel Porter, peering in at them. When he saw them watching, he quickly backed away. Thomas rushed outside. "Porter, what are you doing on my property?" Nathaniel looked embarrassed but defiant. "My mother sent me to see if the rumors were true." "What rumors?" "That Eleanor's living here, playing house with you and your boy." He sneered. "Guess she found someone desperate enough after all." Thomas's fist connected with Nathaniel's jaw before he even realized he'd thrown the punch. The younger man sprawled backward into the snow, blood on his lip. "Get off my land," Thomas growled. "And tell your mother the next time she sends a spy, I won't be so gentle." When Thomas returned inside, his knuckles throbbing, he found Eleanor watching him with wide eyes. "You shouldn't have done that. The Porters practically own this town." "I don't care if they own the whole state," Thomas replied, his voice shaking. "Nobody talks about you that way. Not anymore." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, then slowly reached up to touch his cheek. "Nobody's ever fought for me before." Outside, thick clouds began spitting fresh snow, promising another storm. But inside the Abernathy kitchen, something warm and hopeful bloomed between two people who'd given up on finding love again. "Look at them, whispering like we can't hear," James said, tugging at Thomas's sleeve as they entered the church. Every head turned, every conversation stopped. The Abernathy family had become Millfield's favorite topic since Nathaniel Porter returned home with a bloody lip. Thomas squeezed his son's shoulder. "Heads up, boy. We've done nothing wrong." But his heart sank when he spotted Eleanor already seated with the unmarried women, her Sunday best tight across her shoulders, the only dress she had that wasn't black or gray. Mrs. Porter had made sure no new fabric was sold to her at the general store. "Not in your size, dear," she'd said with false sweetness. Eleanor didn't look their way as they passed, but Thomas saw how she clutched her Bible, knuckles white with tension. Reverend Harper took the pulpit, his gaze sweeping the congregation before settling on Thomas. "Today, we examine the sin of impropriety," he began, voice booming. "Even those bearing the weight of disappointment must not seek comfort in arrangements that defy God's natural order." James whispered, "Is he talking about us, Pa?" Thomas couldn't answer. The sermon felt endless, pointed references to household purity and temptations of the flesh that made the congregation shift uncomfortably. "Those who invite scandal," Reverend Harper continued, "place not only their own souls at risk, but the innocent children in their care." Thomas felt his face burn. This wasn't just town gossip anymore. This was his son's future, their place in the community that sustained them. After the final hymn, Thomas waited for Eleanor by the door, ignoring the stares. When she appeared, her eyes were red-rimmed but her chin was high. "You should have sat with us," Thomas said quietly. "And give them more to talk about?" Eleanor shook her head. "I heard Mrs. Porter arranged a dinner for you to meet the widow Collins." Before Thomas could respond, Mrs. Porter herself approached, her smile sharp as a new blade. "Mr. Abernathy, how wonderful to see James back in good health." She bent toward the boy with exaggerated concern. "We were all so worried when we heard about his fever." "Miss Eleanor made me better," James declared. "She knows special medicine and reads to me every night. She's teaching me big words too." Mrs. Porter's smile tightened. "How educational." Though one wonders what example certain arrangements set for impressionable young minds. Her gaze flicked dismissively over Eleanor. Perhaps, Mr. Abernathy, you might consider more suitable influences? I've taken the liberty of mentioning you to Widow Collins. A respectable woman, with her own house in town. Thomas felt anger rise in his throat, but before he could speak, Eleanor stepped forward. What arrangement would that be, Mrs. Porter? Her voice was calm, but carried across the church steps. Heads turned. Your son made his opinion of my suitability quite clear at the altar. Mrs. Porter's face flushed scarlet. My Nathaniel deserves a wife who doesn't take up too much space? Eleanor finished. Who fades into the background? Well, perhaps you're right. She knelt beside James, placing a hand protectively on his shoulder. But this child deserves someone who will stand firmly in his corner, however much room she occupies. A murmur ran through the lingering congregation. Thomas had never seen Eleanor like this, not defiant exactly, but steady as an oak tree. Come, James, Mrs. Porter snapped, offering her hand. Your father and I need to speak privately. You can play with the Porter children until we're finished. James looked up at Thomas, confusion in his eyes. I want to stay with Miss Eleanor. The boy has spoken, Thomas said quietly. Now if you'll excuse us. Thomas Abernathy. Mrs. Porter's voice rose. Do you understand what you're doing to your reputation? To your business? Who do you think will buy your corn if you continue this arrangement? A crowd had gathered now, including Nathaniel Porter, his jaw still bruised from Thomas's fist. Beside him stood a thin, pinch-faced woman Thomas recognized as the Widow Collins. My brother won't need your business, came a new voice. Thomas turned to see his brother Daniel pushing through the crowd. The Abernathys have been farming this valley since before your husband bought his way into town, Mrs. Porter. Daniel clapped a hand on Thomas's shoulder. And any man who finds happiness after losing what my brother lost deserves support, not gossip. Eleanor's sister Mary appeared beside her, linking their arms. My sister may not be what the Porters wanted, but she's exactly what that boy needs. Anyone with eyes can see it. Thomas felt a surge of gratitude for their families, stepping up when it mattered. But Mrs. Porter wasn't finished. Reverend Harper, she called. Tell them this living arrangement is sinful. The Reverend looked uncomfortable, caught between his wealthiest parishioner and an increasingly supportive crowd. Well, he hedged. Appearances are important, but so is Christian charity. There's nothing charitable about taking advantage of a vulnerable woman. Nathaniel Porter interjected, stepping forward. I did Eleanor a favor by not marrying her. What kind of life could she have given me? Too big to work a proper farm. Too clumsy for delicate tasks. That's enough. Thomas roared, startling even himself with the force of his anger. You speak of a woman who nursed my son through fever when no doctor could reach us, who rebuilt my home from a place of grief to a place of life, who has more kindness in her little finger than you have in your entire family. The churchyard fell silent. Thomas turned to Eleanor, whose eyes were wide with surprise. You were right to avoid scandal, Eleanor, to protect your name. But I'm done pretending. Thomas took her hand in front of everyone. I love you. I think I've loved you since you sat in the rain in your wedding dress, too brave to cry where anyone could see. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's hand trembled in his. Thomas, she whispered. People are watching. Let them watch, he said. Let them see what I see, and not a woman who takes up too much space, but one who fills every corner of a home with warmth. Not someone who was rejected, but someone strong enough to build something new from heartbreak. Mrs. Porter made a strangled sound of outrage. This is preposterous. You can't possibly intend to marry her. Thomas finished. That's exactly what I intend to do, if she'll have me. Eleanor stared at him, tears filling her eyes. You don't have to do this. Not for my reputation. Not for anything but love. Love is exactly why I'm doing it, Thomas said, suddenly aware of how quiet the churchyard had become. Everyone was watching, waiting. Even James stood frozen, his small face serious as he looked between them. What do you say, Miss Mills? Reverend Harper asked, stepping forward with unexpected gentleness. It seems a proposal has been made. Eleanor looked around at the watching crowd, some hostile, some curious, some unexpectedly supportive. Her gaze came to rest on James, who was now grinning ear to ear. "Say yes!" the boy burst out, unable to contain himself. "Please say yes." A surprised laugh escaped Eleanor. She knelt to James's level, taking his hands in hers. "You would be all right with that? With me becoming your Ma?" James finished firmly. "I already decided weeks ago. I heard Pa crying one night after you made that pie, and he said you reminded him of her. Not because you looked the same, but because you loved the same." Thomas felt his throat tighten. He hadn't known James had heard that private moment. Eleanor stood, facing Thomas. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." Thomas pulled her into an embrace, not caring who saw. When they broke apart, he was surprised to see several women dabbing at their eyes. Even Reverend Harper looked moved. "Well," the Reverend said, clearing his throat, "it seems we have a wedding to plan." Mrs. Porter made a final stand. "This is ridiculous. The banns haven't been read. There's no proper—" "Actually," Reverend Harper interrupted, "as the couple was properly engaged before witnesses, I could read the first banns today." He looked thoughtfully at Thomas and Eleanor. "And perhaps, given the circumstances, the bishop might grant a special license for the remaining two." Mary stepped forward. "My sister has a wedding dress already made. Seems a shame to waste it." Daniel nodded. "And I've got enough food stored to feed half the county. We could have a proper celebration at my place until these two decide what's next." Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the community coming together around him. Not with pity for the widower, but with genuine support for a new beginning. Nathaniel Porter stalked away, his mother hurrying after him. The widow Collins disappeared into the crowd. But Thomas barely noticed. He was looking at Eleanor, really looking at her, and seeing not the woman rejected at the altar, but the woman who had saved his son, his home, and perhaps his heart. As they walked home through the melting snow, James ran ahead, whooping with excitement. Thomas reached for Eleanor's hand. "I've been thinking," he began carefully, "about our future, about making this arrangement permanent, but proper." "A wedding," Eleanor said, her voice hushed with wonder. "A real one this time." "Not just a wedding," Thomas corrected. "A marriage, a family." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I know this started as just a job for you. It stopped being just a job the moment James asked me to read him a second story," Eleanor admitted. "And it became something else entirely the night you looked at me across the kitchen table and really saw me. Not as someone too big or too much, but as someone just right." Thomas touched her cheek. "You are just right. For James. For me." He glanced ahead at his son, who was attempting to climb a half-melted snowbank. "For the family we could be." Eleanor's smile was like the spring sun breaking through winter clouds, warm, hopeful, and full of promise. "The family we already are," she corrected softly. The sharp crack of ice breaking on the creek signaled spring's arrival. Thomas stood knee-deep in mud, fixing fence posts damaged by winter storms. His mind wasn't on the task. Today, he would ask Eleanor a question that had kept him awake for weeks. James raced across the muddy yard, boots splashing through puddles. "Miss Eleanor made hot cross buns. She says they're special for Easter." Thomas ruffled his son's hair. "Does she now?" The boy looked healthier than he had in years, cheeks pink, eyes bright. No cough had troubled him since February. "She let me knead the dough myself," James announced proudly, displaying flour-dusted hands. "And she's teaching me my letters. I can write my whole name now." In town, whispers followed Eleanor like shadows. Thomas heard them when he delivered eggs to the general store. Living under his roof all winter, Mrs. Porter had sniffed to her friends. The boy might be fooled, but we all know what sort of arrangement that is. The storekeeper, Mr. Collins, had leaned across the counter after the ladies left. "Don't mind them, Thomas. Folks need something to talk about after being cooped up all winter." He lowered his voice. "But you might want to consider making things proper, for the ladies' sake." Now, washing up for supper, Thomas watched through the window as Eleanor hung laundry on the line. The evening sun caught in her auburn hair. She sang something soft and sweet to herself, a lullaby she often used to soothe James to sleep. "Pa!" James appeared at his elbow. "Is Miss Eleanor going to stay forever?" Thomas dried his hands carefully. "Would you like that, son?" James nodded eagerly. "She makes the nightmares go away, and she doesn't get mad when I spill things." He looked down, scuffing his toe against the floorboard. "She's not like Mama, but she hugs me when I'm sad." Thomas's heart squeezed. "Your mama would like that." That night, after James was asleep, Thomas took out the small wooden box he kept beneath his bed. Inside lay Sarah's silver locket, the one good piece of jewelry she'd owned, passed down from her grandmother. He'd nearly sold it during that terrible winter after her death, when James had been so sick and the doctor's bills mounted. Something had stopped him. Eleanor knocked softly on his open door. "James is asking for a glass of water. I think he's just trying to stay up later." She paused, noticing the locket. "That's beautiful." Thomas gestured for her to enter. It was Sarah's. He hesitated. "Eleanor, there's something I need to ask you." Her eyes widened, one hand automatically moving to smooth her skirt, a nervous habit he'd come to recognize. "Yes, people are talking about us." Her shoulders slumped slightly. "I know. Mrs. Porter made sure I heard every word when I was at the Mercantile yesterday." "Does it bother you?" Thomas asked. Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed. "Not for my sake, but for James, and for you." She met his eyes directly. "Your standing in the community matters. Your farm, your business dealings. I don't want to be the cause of trouble." "That's not what I'm asking." Thomas took a deep breath. "What I mean is, would it bother you to make their gossip meaningless by becoming my wife?" Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "Thomas, you don't have to." "I'm not asking from duty," he interrupted, "or to quiet gossip, though it would." He moved to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "I'm asking because this house became a home again when you walked through the door. Because James needs you. Because his voice caught. Because I need you too." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. "You know what happened last time. What people said." "I'm not Nathaniel Porter," Thomas said firmly. "And thank God for that." A small laugh escaped her. "But what about Sarah? I could never replace." Thomas opened the locket, revealing a small portrait of James as a baby. "Sarah will always be part of us. I'm not asking you to replace her." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pair of scissors. "May I?" Confused, Eleanor nodded. Thomas carefully snipped a small lock of her auburn hair. Then, opening a tiny drawer in the wooden box, he removed a thin strand of blonde hair, Sarah's. With fingers that trembled slightly, he twisted the two locks together, then took a thread from his shirt cuff, one Eleanor had mended the week before. He wound it around the intertwined hair and placed it carefully in the locket opposite James's picture. "We carry what came before," he said simply, "and we move forward, together, if you'll have us." Eleanor stared at the locket, then at Thomas. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." The next morning, Thomas rode into town before dawn. By midday, he'd spoken with the Reverend, purchased a simple gold band from the jeweler, and sent a telegram to his brother in Springfield. Eleanor's sister Martha arrived that evening, summoned by a message Thomas had left at the millinery. "Well," Martha said, surveying the farm kitchen with raised eyebrows, "this is unexpected." Eleanor twisted her hands in her apron. "I know it seems sudden." "Sudden?" Martha laughed. "Sister, I've been expecting this since Christmas. The way Mr. Abernathy looked at you when you weren't watching." She squeezed Eleanor's hands. "Mother would be pleased. She always said you had too much love to give to end up with someone like Nathaniel Porter." 3 days later, Wildflowers covered the muddy farm yard. Thomas and Eleanor stood before Reverend Harper in a small ceremony attended only by James, Eleanor's sister, and Thomas's brother Frank, who'd arrived on the morning train. "You don't have to do this," Eleanor had whispered the night before, a last moment of doubt. "Not for my reputation. Not for anything but love. Only for love," Thomas had assured her, pressing the locket into her palm. "Always for love." Now, as they spoke their vows, James stood between them, holding their hands, a physical bridge connecting past to future. The boy beamed, as if he'd arranged the whole thing himself. When Reverend Harper pronounced them husband and wife, it felt less like a new beginning and more like the recognition of something that had already taken root. Frank slapped Thomas on the back afterward. "Sarah would approve," he said quietly. "She'd want you both happy." Martha hugged Eleanor tightly. "You deserve this," she whispered. "All of it." They shared a simple meal in the farmhouse, Eleanor's fresh bread, ham from Thomas's smokehouse, early spring greens from the kitchen garden. James kept running his fingers over Eleanor's wedding band as if to make sure it was real. "Does this mean I call you Ma now?" he asked suddenly, silencing the adults' conversation. Eleanor looked at Thomas, uncertain. "That's up to you, son," Thomas said carefully. "And up to Eleanor." James considered this seriously. "I think I'll call you Ma," he decided, "because that's what you are now." He frowned. "But I won't forget my first Ma." Eleanor pulled him close. "We never want you to forget her. Love. She'll always be part of us." She touched the locket at her throat. "Right here." That evening, with James finally asleep upstairs after too much excitement, Thomas found Eleanor on the porch, staring at the stars. Night birds called from the woods, and the creek gurgled with spring meltwater. "Any regrets?" he asked, joining her. She turned to him, her face soft in the fading light. "Only that I ever tried to be less than I am," she replied. She touched the locket at her throat. "Your Sarah was a small woman?" "In stature only. In spirit, she was magnificent." Thomas took Eleanor's hand. "Like you." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. "The Porters will still gossip." "Let them," Thomas said. "We know the truth." From inside came a frightened cry. "Ma! Pa!" They exchanged glances, surprise, then understanding. This was their first test as parents together. Eleanor squeezed Thomas's hand, then hurried inside to comfort the boy who had just claimed them both as his own. Thomas lingered a moment longer, looking at the stars. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure if he was addressing Sarah's memory or God or simply the universe that had brought Eleanor to them through pain and rejection. Then he turned and followed his wife into their home. The crash of breaking china echoed through the farmhouse kitchen. Eleanor stared at the shattered pieces of Sarah's teapot on the floor, her hands trembling. Would Thomas be angry? The precious heirloom had survived 3 years without its original owner, only to be destroyed by Eleanor's careless elbow. "Are you hurt?" Thomas appeared in the doorway, concern etched on his face rather than anger. Eleanor shook her head, fighting tears. "It was your mother's, then Sarah's." Thomas knelt, carefully gathering the broken pieces. "It's just a thing, Eleanor, not a memory." He looked up at her. "Not what matters." 6 months into their marriage, Eleanor still sometimes felt like an intruder in Sarah's home. The wedding band on her finger hadn't silenced the whispers in town. If anything, they'd grown louder. She trapped him. Mrs. Porter had declared at the Ladies' Aid Society meeting. Used that poor sickly boy to secure her position. And now look, taking over as if she belonged. Martha had reported these words to Eleanor with sisterly outrage, but they stung nonetheless. Was that how people saw her? As manipulative, taking advantage of a grieving widower? "You're thinking too hard again," Thomas observed, placing the broken teapot pieces on the counter. "I can practically hear the gears turning." Eleanor attempted a smile. "Just wondering what to make for the harvest festival next week." "Liar," Thomas said gently. He pulled her close, his arms solid around her. "What Mrs. Porter says means nothing to me. Or to James." "How did you know?" Eleanor asked, relaxing against him. Martha has a loud voice, and the window was open when she visited yesterday. Thomas kissed the top of her head. Besides, you get a particular wrinkle right here. He touched between her eyebrows. When you're worrying about town gossip. The sound of running footsteps interrupted them. James burst through the door, his school books clutched to his chest, face flushed with excitement. Ma, Pa, Miss Thompson says I can read better than any boy in 3rd grade. She wants me to read aloud at the Harvest Festival. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron, pushing aside her troubles. That's wonderful, James. We'll need to practice. James suddenly noticed the broken teapot. His face fell. Oh, that was Grandma's. Just a thing, Thomas repeated firmly. Now tell us more about this reading. Later that night, with James asleep, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, carefully gluing the teapot pieces together. It wouldn't hold water anymore, but perhaps it could hold flowers or pencils. Still useful, if changed. You should rest, Thomas said, watching from the doorway. You've been tired lately. Eleanor's hands stilled. Have I? Falling asleep before supper's cleared. Napping in the afternoons. Thomas approached, resting his hands on her shoulders. And you've turned green at the smell of coffee 3 mornings running. Heat flushed Eleanor's cheeks. She'd been waiting for the right moment to tell him, gathering courage. When is the baby due? Thomas asked softly. Eleanor's head jerked up. How did you guess? Thomas smiled. My mother had 5 children after me. I recognized the signs. He pulled a chair close, taking her hands in his. When? Early spring, I think. Eleanor bit her lip. Are you happy about it? Happy? Thomas's voice cracked. Eleanor, I never thought I'd have another child. After Sarah. He squeezed her hands. But more than that, I never thought I'd feel this way again. Like the future is something to look forward to, not just endure. Relief washed through her. I was afraid to tell you. Why? Thomas asked. Because. Eleanor hesitated. Because it makes everything real. I'm not just caring for Sarah's child anymore. I'm bringing a new person into this family. Her hand drifted to her still flat stomach. And what if people say this child is why I married you? That I trapped you? Let them talk, Thomas said firmly. We know the truth. The Harvest Festival arrived on a perfect autumn day. Millfield's town square overflowed with produced displays, handcrafts, and food stalls. James stood nervously before the crowd, reading a passage from Tom Sawyer with careful precision. Eleanor and Thomas watched from the front row, pride evident in their faces. When James finished, the applause was enthusiastic, except from the Porter family, who clapped with obvious reluctance. Later, Eleanor's apple pie, made from Sarah's recipe with James as her assistant, was entered in the baking contest. She hadn't planned to compete, but James had insisted. Ma's pie is the best, he told everyone who would listen. Better than Mrs. Porter's, even. To Eleanor's shock, the judges awarded her first prize. As she accepted the blue ribbon, she caught sight of Mrs. Porter's pinched expression. The woman whispered something to her husband, who nodded with a sour look. Their loss, Thomas murmured as they passed the Porter's table without stopping. He squeezed her hand beneath the checkered tablecloth. The encounter with Nathaniel Porter couldn't be avoided forever. He approached as Eleanor was packing their basket for the journey home. Eleanor, he twisted his hat in his hands. Your pie deserved the ribbon. She straightened, meeting his eyes for the first time since that terrible day at the church. Thank you, Nathaniel. He started, then glanced at Thomas, who stood a short distance away, speaking with the blacksmith. I made a mistake. That day. Eleanor's heart thumped painfully. Once, those words would have meant everything to her. Now they seemed hollow. Yes, she agreed simply. You did. Nathaniel stepped closer. If things were different. But they're not, Eleanor interrupted. And I thank God for that every day. She gathered up her prize ribbon and basket. Goodbye, Nathaniel. I wish you well. As she walked away, she felt lighter somehow. as if she'd set down a heavy burden she hadn't realized she was still carrying. The 3-mile journey home stretched before them as the sun began to set. James ran ahead, chasing the first fireflies of the evening. Thomas and Eleanor followed more slowly, their hands linked. "You're different," Thomas observed. "Since talking with Porter." Eleanor nodded. "I finally realized I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She paused. "For so long, I thought being rejected by him was the worst thing that could happen to me. Now I see it was the best." Thomas watched her carefully. "Still, it couldn't have been easy, facing him." "Easier than I expected." Eleanor smiled. "He seems smaller somehow." They walked in companionable silence for a time. Eleanor moved with unexpected care, one hand resting protectively over her midsection as they navigated a rough patch of road. "When were you planning to tell me about the baby?" Thomas asked gently. Eleanor's eyes widened. "But I did tell you. Last week." "When?" "Not me," Thomas laughed, pointing ahead. "James. He's been watching you like a hawk lately, asking me why you're sick in the mornings." "Oh!" Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "I didn't realize he'd noticed." "Nothing escapes that boy." Thomas's expression grew serious. "How do you think he'll take the news?" Eleanor considered this. "He might be worried at first, about sharing our attention." She squeezed Thomas's hand. "But he has such a big heart. I think he'll be a wonderful big brother." "We'll tell him tonight," Thomas decided. Together, as they crested the hill, their farmhouse came into view, golden in the setting sun. James had already reached the front gate and was jumping up and down, waving for them to hurry. "Look!" he shouted, pointing skyward. "The first star." Thomas noticed Eleanor moving more carefully as they climbed the hill. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired. And a little queasy." She smiled ruefully. "Your mother must have been a strong woman, to have 5 children after you." "She was," Thomas agreed, "though not as strong as the woman beside me now." Eleanor's eyes filled with sudden tears. "I was afraid," she admitted, "that there might be too much of me to love." Thomas stopped walking, turning to face her fully in the fading light. "There has never been enough of you," he said firmly. "Every day I discover something new to cherish." Above them, more stars appeared in the darkening sky. James raced back down the hill to meet them, unable to contain his excitement about his reading success and the blue ribbon. "Can we hang it in the kitchen?" he asked breathlessly. "Right where everyone can see it when they visit?" "Of course," Eleanor assured him. "It's your achievement too." James beamed, then grew serious. "I told Johnny Porter that you're a better ma than his ma." He looked worried suddenly. "Was that wrong to say?" Eleanor exchanged glances with Thomas. "It's not kind to compare people that way," she said carefully. "Mrs. Porter is doing her best, just as I am." James considered this. "But you are the best," he insisted. He reached for her hand. "And Pa thinks so too." As they approached the house, James ran ahead to light the lamps. Eleanor paused at the garden gate, suddenly overcome. "Do you think Sarah would mind?" she asked, so softly Thomas almost missed it. "That I'm helping raise her son? That there will be another child?" Thomas looked at the silhouette of their house against the twilight sky. No longer a place of dust and grief, but a home alive with possibility. Windows glowed with welcoming light as James moved through the rooms. "I think she would recognize love in all its forms," he answered, "and know that worth isn't measured by what others see, but by how completely one heart recognizes another." Eleanor touched the locket that still hung around her neck, then reached for Thomas's hand. Inside, they could hear James talking to himself as he set the table for supper, practicing the words he would use to read his next school assignment. "He calls me Ma now without even thinking about it," Eleanor marveled. "As if I've always been here." "In the ways that matter, perhaps you have," Thomas said. "We were waiting for you without knowing it." James appeared in the doorway. "Are you coming?" "I'm hungry as a bear." Eleanor laughed. "Growing boys always are." She exchanged a meaningful look with Thomas. especially big brothers. James's brow furrowed. I'm not a big brother. Not yet, Thomas said gently, placing his hand over Eleanor's on her stomach. But by spring you will be. James's eyes widened as understanding dawned. Really? A baby brother? Or sister? We won't know which until they arrive, Eleanor explained. James whooped with excitement, then rushed to hug Eleanor carefully. I'll be the best big brother ever. I'll teach them everything. He paused, looking up at her with sudden seriousness. The baby won't mind that I'm what, James? Eleanor prompted when he hesitated. That you're not their real ma, like you're not my real ma. The words hung in the air. Thomas started to correct him, but Eleanor raised her hand slightly. James, she said, kneeling to his level despite her tiredness. Families are made in many ways, some by birth, some by choice, but they're all real. She touched his cheek gently. I may not have given birth to you, but I am really, truly your mother in my heart. And I will be this baby's mother too. James considered this, then nodded decisively. That makes sense. He patted her stomach. Baby, you're lucky. Our ma gives the best hugs, and she never gets mad when you spill milk, and she can fix anything that's broken. Thomas's throat tightened as he watched them. Come on then, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Let's get supper on the table. James tugged them both toward the house, eager to be home. Together they walked toward the waiting house, three shadows merging into one as they crossed the threshold. A family measured not by convention but by the fullness of their love.